Okay, I'm going to start off. I don't have a prepared speech or any slides, and what I would love is if people have questions that they just ask them. But I'll walk through the basic presentation. It's about insulators coming from 21 BC, and I will preface that there's actually an insulator, which you can grab the handout if you want. Right here that was used 40 BC. And that's a big deal. That's the oldest one that we know of in the hobby. Rick Solar actually owns it. And when I say 40 BC, it's before Cauvet. And Cauvet is the guy that patented the threads, and this is a threadless collection, so it has to be before Cauvet. So this is 40 BC. 1825 patent. It's a lightning rod insulator. There's some literature here on it. And just to give you an idea what it looks like, there's actually pictures of it. It's a cool piece, but I'm really talking about telegraph insulators. So the first telegraph insulator, it was actually a bunch of cloth wrapped in gutta percha. They tried to start the telegraph line from Baltimore to Washington when Samuel Morse, aka the Morse Code, went to the president and said, hey, I want some funding for something. It's a lot easier way to communicate with electricity than by horse, because that was the next fastest mode of communication, or train if there was a train going that direction. So they finally got funding, and you'll see up here in 1844, they tested the Morse line. It didn't work with the cloth that they were wrapping the lines in. So they went to the bureau knob insulator, which is a CD 780, which is this guy here. This is the CD 780. And this is the first insulator ever used for a telegraph. It was used actually a couple places in the country, but it went from Baltimore to Washington. And the first message ever put on an insulator on a telegraph from Samuel Morse was, "What hath God wrought?" In other words, what did he create that we can now talk through the wires? So it's called the bureau knob. And this one actually came from Maine, which was used on the Bain line, which was put in the 1840s. And I got this one in a catalog, and there were pieces from the telegraph office that were dug with this insulator. And it's the only one that I've ever got to hold, but it's a really cool piece. It's smaller than normal, and if anybody wants to see it or hold it, you can. Anybody want to, or are you just too nervous? Please don't drop it. So that's the first one. It's kind of cool if you want to see the first one. So after that, things progressed. The blocks are very similar in age. And the interesting thing about the blocks is they started in the 1840s, but they were actually made all the way up into like 1910 and 20. There's things in Brookfield catalogs that still have the glass blocks for sale. It's my opinion, and I can't guarantee this, that the 1003 blocks, which are very similar in color, were the newer ones, and a lot of the older ones were in a lot of the different colors. There's many different block type insulators, some of the Yandell patents. There's a pretty cool one. A lot of this information, if you get Reed's book, The Telegraph in America, it's got tons of this information, which is readily available, and I think it's all online now. I forget if it's Bob and Elton put a lot of this stuff where you can get it on Icon or at the NAA website. But this is kind of a cool thing for a glass block. This guy, it's 1006. It has a little V groove, and it basically sat in the crossarm. They would put a groove through the crossarm, cut out a square, a chisel on each end. It would sit in so it couldn't slide. And what most people don't know about these guys, and again, I think this is in Pope's book, this same piece comes with a top. And that sits on top of this piece. So what they did, most of these blocks had a cap. This sat on top of the block, went inside the cross arm, and then they would put a piece of wood over the cap, and then that would keep this from popping out. But it also had glass on the top and the bottom of the wire. So that's kind of, you know, it's a big deal where a lot of people, because this doesn't look like an insulator because there's nothing to tie to it, there's no grooves. So many times it gets just thrown out because people don't know what it is, but it's a top to a very rare 1006 CD block insulator. I'm keeping an eye on that bureau knob now. Don't throw it. He's not a good catch. Then we've got a lot of the older, we call them Lefferts Hooks, even though Leffert had nothing to do with making them. They were actually used by Lefferts on some of his lines. And these are all the hooks, and you know, technically we don't have CDs for them as threadless, but they date back to that same era. And these guys basically hang upside down. There's a groove on the side of them, and the fatter hooks have the narrower groove, and the narrower hooks, you can see there's, I'm going to put this over here, I'll show you a narrow and a wide. So these are the two different type of Lefferts hooks. There's a narrow groove in this one and a wider groove in the narrow one. And I just think opposite when I look at them. And what these did is they went into a cross arm. Then there was a wood dowel that went through this and it kept it from falling out. And then the metal was embedded and poured in with the glass. And this one's really a great example. If you see how crude, you'll see how crude the bubbles are. If you look at it, I'm going to do this for the camera, where iron and glass really weren't meant to mix when things were being manufactured. There's several other what we would consider threadless insulators. I've been collecting these sleeves for many, many years, and then God bless Jeff Katchko. He actually dug one up with the hook in it to finally authenticate that this is the same thing that was in Reed's book. Similar to this block, you'll see that the hole goes all the way through. It's a cobalt block, and there's pictures and graphics of all these in some of the old books. I've done tons of research. A lot of you know, a lot of you don't know, but there's several hundred books here in my research library, and guys like Elton Gish finally got this stuff public so people can research. But there's Tillotson catalog, Greeley catalogs, Hemingway catalogs, Brookfield catalogs. So all of a sudden you know what the pieces were because they're actually being sold in these books and magazines. So when we find something, you can authenticate it by actually looking up the historical information. And a lot of times I would see something here and say, well, that doesn't exist. It was just something that they were, you know, hopefully going to sell someday. And then all of a sudden, 10 years later, someone digs one up. And every time I've said it didn't exist, I've seen someone find one later on. So even though they weren't in a hobby, they're out there. If they're in these books, they're being made, because there's at least 10 or 15 of them. When I started studying, we all knew they didn't exist, and all of them are now CDs. So they're there. We just haven't found them yet. Like the Lewis Patton was one of them. perfect pictures of it. Nobody ever saw one. And all of a sudden, Mark Newton starts sticking them up in Lyndeborough, New Hampshire. And now we've got a new CD. So it does happen all the time. All right, so here's some stuff I'm not sure everybody realizes. On a glass block, anybody that has one, they basically would, again, drill 4 holes, and then this would sit inside the 4 holes of the cross arm, and then cut across the cross arm so they could drop this in, then it couldn't slide. You would kink the wire, because the groove on here is kinked, drop it in, the wire can't go up and down. I think what most people don't realize with these and the Harlows and the Brooks patent with the claws is that I always looked at the Brooks patent and the Harlow patent and said, geez, why were they so stupid to have the wire so tight with the claws, because it's just going to break off the claw. And it happens all the time, and the claws always broke off. And I said, what a bunch of dummies. Then you start reading a book like Wiring a Continent or something, and you start to understand that if those claws weren't there, and Brook advertised it as an insulator without tie wires, so there was no intent to use a tie wire. But what happened is, if you just have the wires sit inside the groove, and all of a sudden there's one telephone pole or telegraph pole that's 150 feet apart, and another one's 80 feet apart, or you're on the side of a hill, all that wire just slides through, the wire goes down, it sags, and it's sitting on the ground, you lose all communication. So you had to stop the wire from sliding on the insulator, which is why the claws made you kink the wire. Well, how does that work with a block? This is the little piece of steel that goes inside the block, and when you pull it, it tightens, and that stops the wire from sliding inside a block. Most of the people don't understand or realize that the blocks all had this piece that went with them, but when you look at the piece on its own, it gets lost and people don't know what it is. So I have one of these if anybody wants to look up on it, because without that, the wires are kind of useless because they just slide through and the wire bunches up at the longest span. It's a pretty cool thing, but I don't know how many people have ever seen that, but it stops the wire from sliding in a block or any insulator like that with a hole. And because I have a good memory, it says metal on here, so I know which piece it goes with. So this came with that piece. These are two, from what I understand so far, these are one of a kinds. Just take a peek at them. They don't look really exciting. This will get a new CD. This one I've had for years, but it's a different type of a hook. It's in one of the articles that I've written a long time ago. But take a peek at them, because they're, to my knowledge, nowhere else but here. There's a bunch of one of a kinds here by color, and I can point some of them out. So just a couple of them, like to my knowledge, it's the only milk glass 731. We've got a yellow 731 by color, a purple Tillotson, which is another unique color. Down at the lower base, it's a 739.3 in a green. So there's a lot of pieces here that are pretty unique. And I'll get over here to the counterparts afterwards, but feel free to come up and look at some of them, because it's been a lifetime trying to gather them all and get them in one spot. I'm going to go to the counterparts, which is the thing that I don't know that anybody has ever gotten all the counterparts in one spot, and I didn't get it till this year. And as crazy as it sounds, I had a piece show up at this show that just went on my case, and I'll describe the counterparts because they're really kind of cool. So a counterpart is basically an insulator that started off threadless and then went threaded, and in many cases was the exact same outside mold, and all they did was switch the plungers. So it really helps date things, and you'll see the different CDs here. The chart up above shows you what's on the shelf, and if you're interested in the counterparts, there's a handout that will show you the CDs and the EIN numbers that go along with each piece. There's also some pictures of them, and it'll show you the pictures, but just in the case of the 131, 731, there's 4 pieces here that aren't in the book yet, and they will be as different EINs. And I took pictures of them in the back where when I was trying to do exact mold matches, you'd have one with a 6 and a 6, and then one with a number over number, and the one that had this sideways 7, I forget the name for it. But now we've got mold matches with a 731 and a 131. So these will all get added into the book. But it's really cool to see all the pieces in one spot. Some of the stuff that's a little bit unusual, which I went kind of nuts over. So this ERW showed up today or yesterday, and it's got a little repair on it, but it's not a big deal to almost anybody in a hobby. But it ended up being an exact mold to mold match with the threadless ERW. So as of today, we have an exact mold match. My ERW, the R was a little bit tighter at the base, the 2 legs, and that one it was the exact same mold. So it's kind of cool. Like, the problem is we don't know if there was ever an exact mold match, which is why I end up collecting all these threadless, because I can find out if there actually was. Yesterday I found out there is an exact mold match to the ERW. So now you've got the 735 and the, or 736 and the 135.5. Okay, so this one was one of my favorite discoveries ever. We were digging the Lindeboro dump in New Hampshire, which was an Oakman manufacturing plant. And that's where some of the new corkscrews, the Lewis patents, came out. And this is a simple 134 that came out of that dump. What are you saying?
I'm talking to him.
Oh.
He's in the corner drinking and stuff of your video.
Okay. So anyway, this is a 134. The Lindeboro or Oakman 134s have a unique characteristic in some of them. And on the inside of the skirt, and I'll try to go up to the camera so they can see it, there's a vertical bar. And it's unique to the Oakman, but they didn't all have them, but a lot of them did. So So the vertical bar on the inside of the skirt, when they pulled out the plunger, a lot of the old Oakmans would twist and warp at the base because they had to put enough force to take these out. This plunger expanded, and that little vertical bar kept it from twisting. So one day I'm looking at the insulators on the shelf. This is a 728.5. It's a very rare piece. I think there's another one. I think there's at least one more. I don't know if there's one beyond that. I think Tommy Bolek has one and this one. And I don't know how many people have seen a 728.5. Okay, I'll explain this piece because it's really cool. Cauvet was kind of out of his mind. He was a genius, but he didn't have a real grasp of reality. When Cauvet patents the threads in 1865, they worked. So everybody's changing over to threaded. And Cauvet's like, oh, I have another idea. What about the split pin? We'll do a split pin. So this is, I'm sorry, yeah, Oakman. Oakman's like, what about a split pin? You don't want to buy this threaded stuff from Cauvet. So he comes up with a split pin, and there's 2 grooves on the side of the threadless insulator, and when you push it onto the pin, there's a wedge between the split. It pushes the 2 sides of the pin out, and then you can never pull it off again, like those Chinese finger traps. So, and I'm going to admit complete idiocracy on my end. I had a bunch of folks over the house one day, and I was explaining the split pin to them. I said, no, if you push it in here, that wedge is going to come in, and it does this, and it pushes it out, and I could never get it out again. So, the pin was stuck in the insulator forever because it worked, okay? So that was kind of nuts. And then that didn't take off because no one wanted to buy the special pins, and the thread worked. So then Mr. Oakman says, oh, I got a better idea. And I did write something on this for one of the other shows. So what the 728.5 does, it's hard to see, but the top of the 728.5 has 2 corners on it that you could put a flat piece of wood to it, but you couldn't twist it, okay? So, and I'll go up to the camera so they can see it. There's 2 corners on the 728.5. But also on the 728.5, in opposite direction, so the corners are here, but on the sides, there's 2 dimples that come in. So the dimples come in 90 degrees from the wedge on the top of the 728.5. And if you look at the insulator through the pinhole, the 2 wedges on the top are going one direction, the 2 dimples are going the other direction. So you scratch your head, you say, all right, what's going on with this? And I'll show this to the camera, and then I'm going to need a prop to come up here. Do it till it's square.
Take your hand out from the back of it to let the light through. There you go. And turn it a little bit.
Okay, so I need Carol Merrill from behind door number 2. You want to be my, no, nobody's going to come up. All I need is, I need 2 hands, not a hand. I don't need anybody to clap. Okay, so here's how it works, all right? The 2 dimples on the side are going to be his hands. And I think everybody turn a little more this way so those guys, okay. So these are the 2 dimples on the side. The pin was a flat pin, squared off. So the pin, and I'm going to make it a little narrower because that's the whole key. The pin would slide up in between the 2 dimples. But the vertical on the top was the opposite direction. So what you would do is when you got the pin in here, you turn the insulator or the pin, and then now the top slides down in the vertical position, keeping the insulator from turning. Once it's here, it can't pull off the pin. So it was a really clever way of doing a threadless. Thank you. You want to give him a hand? Woohoo! But it was a really cool way of keeping an insulator on a pin with ice and rain and snow, because the literal gravity of the insulator itself kept the direction, and the direction, once it turned 90 degrees, it couldn't pull off because of the 2 dimples on the side. But then it's like, okay, Oakman, wake up. The threads work. So no one's going to buy special pins. No one. There's an invention. It worked. I apologize. Bill Snell's like the Oakman king, and I'm trashing his hero. But it's true. He was not a great businessman. He was a genius, inventor. And to his credit, he did invent the threads on the bottles. So there's a lot of bottles out there now, much more than insulators. But he did do a lot of patents on the bottles. He did patents on weaving machines, had a ton of patents. But it's just a cool piece that most people really don't know about. Pardon? Oh, he patented years on the Mickey?
Columbia and the Mickey.
Oh, that's right, the Columbia and the Mickey. We've got our Hemingway expert that's also an Oakman man. So he had a ton of patents that did work, but he couldn't get over the threaded, the Cauvet's patent, and Cauvet won, period. How much time do we have?
However long you want.
Oh, okay. All right. So another cool thing that, again, I'm just trying to point out stuff that I think a lot of people don't know about, and I'm not trying to like pretend like I know more, but there's some real subtleties with some of the pieces, and one of them is the weight insulator. Mike Tucker did a great article on that. But what was really cool about those, when we were doing all our research, a lot of the pictures in there, I was sending them from the collection, but Wade did something, and it's tying into the threadless thing, where there were intentional little dents on the inside of the pinhole. Does someone have the bureau knob?
It's on the table.
Oh, got it. Okay. I'm going to pass this one around just because I'll pass two of them around just so you can see and understand it. But you see the little dents on the outside in the ribs. Those are there to keep the tar or the pitch engaged on the insulator. And Bob and I were just talking about this. Gee, do you think this insulator came after the smooth one? That would be a duh, right? The smooth one would pop out if it would get freeze and thaw, the pitch or the tar, and then it'd pop out. So they said, how do we keep these from popping out? So they put these dents in them, and these dents on the outside, like the braille, then would engage with all the pitch, and the pitch would soak into the wood. So the wood is not going to slide, the insulator is not going to slide, and all of a sudden the Wade works. Uh-oh, what about the pin? What keeps it from coming on and off the pin? So to show how these work, everybody can get mad at me and boo me and all that stuff, it's okay. I cut one in half. Boo, the crowd. For educational purposes, so you can see how much pitch was put inside the piece. They would fill it with pitch, jam the insulator on like a whole pile of glue, and this stuff cured very quickly because it was heated to make it melt. It turns into a solid, but you can see how this guy went and how much pitch went in here to hold that insulator in place. And that was a big deal on how there's a lot of different tops and shapes to the Wades. The wood on the outside was there to resist projectiles, rocks, arrows, and other things. It had a lot of good things about it. The bad thing was if the Wade itself cracked, you couldn't tell, and then the signal would drown out and you'd lose communication. It did protect it from projectiles. It also, over time, there was pitch on the outside, and as that eventually wore out, then the wood would absorb the moisture, and then you start to trap the moisture inside, and then maybe it doesn't work so well. This is kind of the whole combination all put together, so if you want to come up and look at it with the pin, the insulator, and in this particular case, instead of putting pitch on the inside, it was the classic burlap with the cement, and they used that to try to hold the weight in place. That over time didn't work, which is why Cauvet had his patent, because again, freeze thaw, that cracks, the pin pulls out, and it doesn't work, especially with a heavy wind. So Wade decided, hey, how do I keep this from separating from the pin? And when I pass this around, you'll see inside, there's a whole bunch of little dimples that dent in on the pin. So now if you fill it with pitch or cement, it can't slide because they're going to fill in all these little dents that are now in the glass. And when you look at them now, because a lot of times we think, oh, it was just a cold pour, it was an under pour, they didn't put enough glass in, there's some cool crudeness. That was by design. And we've handled enough of them that we know it's by design. And even more, I think, proof of that, if you look at the 725, which is a much tougher Wade to find, it had the concave much meatier piece, but it was concave. Well, what's the concavity do? Well, if this is filled with pitch and glued by heat to the wood, it can't slide in and out. So now this is good to seal the wood, but again, what keeps the pin from coming out? If you look inside these, all of a sudden you're going to go, hey, wait a minute. There's 3 big dents on every one that would fill up with pitch, and that would keep this from sliding on and off the pin. And it's an intentional indentation on the pins, which again, I don't know how many people realize or don't realize it. It's just little subtleties that people like me with OCD obsess over. But it's a really cool little detail. And then we'll pass it around because all the ones, I have 3 of these, but the 3 I have all have the same 3 dents in the same spot. And then it's consistent with the other ones. So it's really a cool thing that Wade did over time to try to make these things work. What else? All right. So the other thing on the counterparts, the Brookfield had the 731s and the 131s. And the 731 is another transition piece. You'll see on the case behind me. I'll take this off. There's 731s embossed Brookfield. The unembossed is much harder to find in a threaded, not in a threadless. But there's an unembossed, threadless and threaded that actually are mold matches. And then down on the bottom, there's 3 more pairs of 731 131s. And those EINs are not in the book, but they'll be in the book coming up that are exact mold matches. There was only 1 in the 731 category, but now we've got 4. And the handout here will have pictures of some of the new ones that are actually out there. And it has to do with, they'll have a number 6 on the back, some will have a number over a number, but both and there's exact matches here in the threadless and the threaded, which is kind of cool when you have a counterpart that's kind of a mold for mold match. All right, so these bad boys drove me out of my mind. The 743s, at one time there were 3 CDs for these, and then the nasty Dario DiMare showed up and smashed them into one. Because I found out that 95% of the people, even seasoned people in the hobby, didn't know the difference because they were too close. But in reality, there's 3 fundamental differences, but then some of them have wide dome, narrow domes. But the biggest difference in discerning what they were is what I call the verticality. So the earlier ones had a straight base, vertical, perpendicular, and then a tilted top. The cannonball one, as we call it, has a perpendicular base, perpendicular top. It goes straight up and then makes the circle. All right, so this is straight, straight. This one is straight, slant. And this guy is slant, slant. So those were the 3 different shapes, but within these, there's different shapes. So we just separated them all by EINs, but there's something really cool. I've got, and some of these are double threads. This is a double thread that actually goes along with a threadless, and there's a normal thread that goes along with the threadless, all of them with the same outside mold. Are we almost done?
Can I make a quick announcement?
Attention in the hall, Marcia Wills, I have your phone, it'll be at the registration desk.
And I'm just going to show you one mold to mold match, which was really cool because these 2 guys are identical in their outside mold. And the characteristic, and I'll go up to the camera, there's a little roughness here where the mold had been worn out. And anytime you scratch away a mold, it adds to the insulator because it's a negative process. So if there's a dent in the mold, it's an outie in the insulator. So this guy has a little bit of roughness perpendicular to the mold line, and then the threadless has the identical roughness perpendicular to the mold line. And these are the things that I try to find are the exact molds. So with the Canadian stuff, there's a lot of extra threaded mold counterparts. I do not have all of them. I have all the basic shapes, but I don't have all the exact mold for molds. And it's hard to say to someone, I want this threadless, this EIN, but it's got to have a little piece sticking out on the right-hand side of the seam, like nobody. So I just buy them and hope that I can find one, and then I'll sell them later. So that's how you end up doing this stuff. There's no magical way to try to find mold matches other than get as many as you can. And since we're in the south here with not quite south of the Mason-Dixon, but Gettysburg and Civil War, I did try to bring a lot of the stuff from the Civil War dig, the Richmond dig, which I went to. And then behind me, there's what I call the egg tree, which is about 10 of them melted together vertically. And then we have fried eggs, scrambled eggs, got eggs over easy. And there's every gradation back here from a perfectly mint one to a flat egg. And you can see the different levels of the fire. And basically what happened here was when Sherman was doing the march to the sea, nobody knew what direction they were going to go. They don't know because he didn't tell, hey, we're going to turn left when we get to Albuquerque, right? So in the mail warehouse along the James River in Richmond, they sat back and it's like, okay, we got to get out of here. We don't know if he's coming. So they gather all their supplies. They burn the warehouse behind them so the Yankees can't use the supplies. And then what was left is a lot of melted ones and a lot of really good condition ones. You'll see there's a cobalt here, which is a tough color for a Confederate egg. There's also an aqua egg, which is a rare color for a Confederate egg. There were a lot of CD738s, which are here on display that came out of that same dig. And it was an incredible, incredible find. Before that, I never even held a 701.6. And then all of a sudden, you know, we pull out a couple hundred, and it was pretty amazing. But there's a lot of stuff here from that Civil War dig, including some teapots. All right, now the rest of this, I don't know if people have questions or, you know, understand the difference between the different, like the sandwich eggs and the California eggs. There's a lot of different pieces here. There's stuff that has the original hardware on it, so you can understand, like the Cal egg. I can tell it's original because I can't get it off. So this one even Dario could figure out, but this is one of the big spikes got nailed into the side of a telegraph pole, and that's what held up a Cal egg. Not in all cases, but certainly in the case of this puppy, which is a pretty cool piece. All this stuff is over here, and if people want to come up, I have no problem with people handling this stuff. If I'm here, I can just hand it to you, or you can look at it, because I think seeing it and like that, the way, understanding how those dents work is pretty hard to describe until you hold it in your hand. What else we got here? I'll put this guy back. All right, so this puppy's incredibly rare. It's the only one of these in this color. Bob Starr wants it bad. And there were 3 of these that were found in Ohio, and they were on a house. And what's really cool is if you tie this together with, and we'll go over here and look at the Floyd patent. The guy that had these, again, there were 3 of them. There's 2 of them on display. But over at the Floyd Patent, this was the CD, the actual Floyd Patent CD with the groove in it is over there on the shelf. This is the actual patent itself, because the guy that had these insulators and was testing these insulators had the original patent. Kevin Jacobson bought this and then made a frame for it so you could see the original patent. This is the actual pin that it was used, and it flares out. And basically the top of the pinhole flared out. They just squared off the top and made it, say, 1/4 inch wide in all directions. Once that popped in and flared out, you couldn't pull off the insulator. And then the insulator itself are these guys. And this is an actual Floyd patent, and if you want to come and hold it, it flares out at the top. You put it on, it pops out, it doesn't come off. It's similar to the split pin, but it was just a springy connection. They did have the patent where this would work in wood as well, but it was relying on the wood to split out on its own, not with the wedge, which would have been the Oakman split pin patent. So they're very similar, but yet different. This is much more rare than the split pin. The split pin was very rare until a whole bunch of them were found, both the Boston and the Oakman. There's Oakman inner skirt embossed, not base embossed, which is a weird thing to see embossing on an inner skirt, you know, the inside of the skirt. It's pretty unusual, but that's what Oakman was. He was pretty unusual. And there were 3 different types of those, the Oakman, the Boston, and the unembossed. And I think the unembossed is the rarest of the split pins because Oakman put his name on everything. Okay. I don't necessarily have to walk you through this stuff. If you guys have questions on some of these, I'm going to open it up to that. Otherwise, you know, we can talk about some of the crazy colors and shapes, and there's some nutso pieces. I'll do one more just because, like you know, does anybody know what CD this is? It's a 729.6. So it's such a stupid CD, nothing meant about it, but it's such a rare CD, and it just says patent applied for on the base, and we know nothing else about it. Most people don't even know it exists. But it's just a different shape that's been around a long time that there's no mention of it because there aren't any. You know, it's one of those things where I'm sitting here, now there's 2 of them on display, but it's base embossed, you know, with a patent, and I know nothing else about them other than they're very, very rare, and that nobody else seems to know anything about them, because I ask, what about them? And they say, what CD? And then you scratch your head, and I'm on to the next CD. Anybody know anything about these? No, it's a normal pinhole.
Oh, okay, I see. Oh, okay. The way you were holding it.
So I point out stuff like that because it sits on the shelf, and people don't necessarily understand or care, but there's some really weird stuff out there that it's so hard to find that nobody ever gets to see them. They don't understand them, so it never comes up as a subject. So when you're looking at some of this stuff, feel free to ask questions. And I'm going to put this back up, and if it's open for questions, then, you know, ask me anything.
You talk about teapots for a second?
Sure. Had a question on the teapots. Okay, so we got the big one and the little one. The 790 and the little one's a 790.1, which there's one here as well. Actually, there's 2 here. One of them is very, very transparent, but for the most part, all we knew about the teapots for many, many years, they came out of Mobile Bay. There was a big dig. Everybody went out of their minds over them, including me. these were used for and during the Civil War. This in the slash top was a Southern insulator for the most part, and the key to these was they could put up the poles very quickly, drop a teapot on it, drop the wire on it, and don't forget we can't have a wire that's not tied. We learned that from the blocks and the Harlows. But they would drop the wire on it initially to get the line up so they could actually communicate, then come back and put the tie wires on later, because communication was critical. If you could say, hey, these guys are attacking us in the northwest corner, and get the telegraph, that would give these guys 5 hours notice to start to get their defenses in order so they could defend themselves. So communication during the Civil War via telegraph was very, very important. So this in the slash top, I'll grab a slash top.
Dario, was that primarily used on covered bridges?
We'll get to that in a second, yes. So these are the two types that were used. Same theory applied here. You could drop it on the split at the top. So these guys were used for and during the Civil War for quick assembly. Now, they weren't just used there, to answer your question. There were some of these found on covered bridges, but also there was a guy here today, there he was, he just brought me a picture. 2 of these in use just outside of Pottstown, Pennsylvania. There's a photograph, he said that's about 10 miles from my house. There's 2 of them on a pole. So a lot of these, the teapots were used, at least I know, in Pennsylvania, and they were used crossing rivers because Al Kaplaska had found them, and Al's not with us any longer, but he had talked about seeing these on a bridge crossing a river in Pennsylvania. So there you go. Okay, where was it? Whitesville Columbia Bridge. So they weren't just southern. They did make their way up north, but that was the whole hobby for many, many years. The only resource we had was the Mobile Bay dig. And now there are ones that were used up north as far as Pennsylvania, to what we know, and there's actual photographs of them on a pole, which is really cool. I mean, it's just fun to learn this stuff. And I'll show you one of the ones that came from PA, and you'll see the difference. So this is a 791, 790. It's smaller, but you can also actually see through it. I'll put it up against the glass. And this one was found in Pennsylvania. This one's Mobile Bay. I have, not anymore, I had 8 teapots at one time. So I got to look at all the molds, realized I don't need 8. If I have the same mold, got rid of some of the ones and kept some of the better ones, but had enough to look at to try to understand the difference between which ones were made where and how they were used. And if you look at this in the light, it's hard to find teapots with any type of transparency to them. So I'll just put it up against the light real quick so you can see. You see that? What's that? Well, and that's the whole point. Most people, and Dennis, that's the stuff I'm just trying to show you. A lot of this stuff, you only hold one in your life, so you don't really understand until you hold a pile of them. And I just started collecting threadless in 1967, and I'm a little more open about it now. I came out and admitted I was a threadless-aholic. So I do, obsess over these stupid things, but it's interesting, and you can. I want to share as much as I can with everybody because it's really cool to see it live, and anybody was welcome to come over the house. But more questions? Does that answer on the teapots? Anything else? Anybody have any other questions about threadless? No? 3, 2.
A little bit about the
tiny and then huge, all for the same job. What was it?
Oh, okay. So one question came about the size. It ain't the size and the shape of the ship. Okay, here's two threadless trying to do the same thing. There's a tad difference. I don't know if anybody can tell the difference between these two. Ah, right. This one has one wire group. Very good. Different color. We're getting there. Rounded top. Very good. See, these guys, you're very astute. You know, we can hide this one in here if you're not sure, if you know the difference. But the big question was, why big, why little? In most cases, if it was just telegraph, because that's what this was, think about it, 1865, there was no phone. 1876 is when the phone was invented. So these weren't used for high tension wire, they weren't used for anything except signal. They were telegraph, so it had a wire on it. The difference is these, which I dug one, were used in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and they mostly used the big ones at river crossings. Because the wire span was so much further, this could take a lot more tension on it and not break to cross an entire river. So everyone that I know that was found near a river or a huge valley or something where the pole-to-pole distance was way beyond the average span of a normal insulator. These are Canadian. Most of them are black glass. I just brought the aqua one because it's just a little tougher to find. And these were all, I just lost the line, Battleford. So we call them the Battlefords, but they're baby Battlefords, and there's 3 or 4 different shapes, different square collar, round collar, but they're cool insulators, but they did the exact same thing. The biggest of the big, these guys were the ones that did river crossing. Everything else was just a normal insulator carrying a telegraph line. And I will show you the 736-5 is much, much harder to find than the 6. And it's got the narrower dome. It's a really tough CD. You know, and not that this guy isn't tough. This is the biggest one, you know, ever made. And I think John Rapole has one for sale, the river crossing ones. But this guy is, I don't know, there's maybe a couple dozen. I don't know if there's more than 2 or 3 of these. You know, I just got this recently, but the 736.7 is still extremely rare because of its shape and size. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
The 143, the double-threaded Canadian insulators, were they double-threaded so that they could cut threads on a threadless pin?
Okay, the question was the 143 double-threaded. Were they intentionally threaded that way so they could cut the pins? Number one, this is a threadless. I'm just teasing. But I will lower myself to speak about a threaded insulator. Just for, I'll stoop to that level because I do collect threaded as well. But so let me grab one. There's a person here who has probably picked more of these than I don't know, probably 75% of them in the hobby, all right, the double threads. To our knowledge, no, they weren't meant to cut pins. They were meant to screw on faster because you had 2 threads and you could spin it 3 times. It went all the way down the pole. If it was a normal threaded, you'd have to spin it 6 times to go all the way down. So someone said, hey, these will go a lot quicker. Bill Rosado, who did a lot of picking in Canada. It was so cool. He goes, I can spot a double thread in 2 seconds. Why? Because they put the double thread on a normal threaded pin and they were always crooked. So whenever there was an insulator that wasn't perpendicular in Canada, oh, add a 0 to the price, it was a double thread. So he'd be up the pole, switching it out, and ended up with a pile of double threads. So the double threads are really a cool piece, but from what I understand, it was speed, okay, that was designed. The only one that was theoretically designed to cut a pin were the Bostons that had, and it didn't work because you're trying to cut hard oak with dull glass, and they say, gee, I wonder why this segmented thread broke. You know, they had the big groove on the top, it was faceted, so you could get a big wrench on it to twist, and all you did was break the insulator that much faster. So it didn't really work. Oak is very, very hard, and glass is very easy to break. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
So I just want to, especially recognize Dario for doing this. He's got an amazing collection, and for him to pack it all up and bring it here and go through this discussion is a level of commitment and fear and security to bring the babies out and show them. And so one more round of applause for Dario. All right, we're down to the second to the last option. Second to last option, so let's go through this and see what we win. All right, our first item, Kansas and Missouri Bell telephone bell.
On the far end, what is that insulator?
Oh, that's called an underarm. It went upside down. It's
all right,
mostly from Britain, from what I understand.
074
It's mostly from Britain.
23
It was used when the Atlantic cable was put in 1858.
That's very cool. Great presentation.
Thanks.
You got me a question I should have asked you yesterday. Is there anyone who has compiled a list of all the companies that made Threadless in their years of
No,
operation?
because we don't know who made most of them.
Okay, but, you know, like
They're too
the-
old. We don't know. I mean, we don't know who made Lefferts. We just know Lefferts used them.
Oh, really? I didn't
Yeah,
know that.
well, Lefferts
Okay.
isn't a glass house. Lefferts is just a user, like Tillotson. Tillotson didn't make glass. Brookfield made most of the
I had
Tillotson
a
glass.
theory Brookfield made Tillotson, but I wasn't sure. So. Okay, that's interesting to know.
Well, what do you think?
I'm retired. I don't have to think anymore.